Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the hangar at Edwards Air Force Base, her weathered hands running along the side of her assigned aircraft. The F-16 Fighting Falcon had seen better days. Paint chipped from its nose, and the canopy bore the scratches of countless missions. While the other pilots strutted around their sleek F-35 Lightning jets, Sarah's fighter looked like something from a museum. "Look what they gave the old lady," sneered Lieutenant Jake, barely 25 and fresh from flight school. His voice carried across the hangar, drawing snickers from the other young pilots. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not on the flight line." Sarah had heard it all before. At 42, she was older than most of the squadron commanders, let alone the pilots. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and laugh lines crinkled around her green eyes. She had been flying for 20 years, but to these young hotshots, she was just another relic clinging to her wings. "Maybe they're trying to tell you something, Mitchell," called out Captain Hayes, polishing the gleaming surface of his F-35. "Time to hang up the helmet and let the real pilots handle the heavy lifting." The younger pilots laughed, but Sarah said nothing. She had learned long ago that words meant little in the cockpit. Actions spoke louder than any comeback she could deliver on the ground. Colonel James, the squadron leader, approached with his clipboard and stern expression. He was a by-the-book officer who believed in tradition and hierarchy. "Mitchell, you'll be flying support missions. Reconnaissance, cargo escort, that sort of thing. The F-35s will handle the real combat scenarios." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." "Look," Sarah said, lowering his voice slightly, "I know you've got experience, but these new birds have technology you can't match. Stealth capabilities, advanced radar, weapons systems that can engage targets you can't even see. Your F-16 is a fine aircraft, but it's from another era." Another era. Sarah had heard those words so many times they had lost their sting. She watched as the younger pilots climbed into their state-of-the-art fighters, their confidence as polished as their aircraft. They had simulators, virtual reality training, and computers that could practically fly the plane for them. What they didn't have was what Sarah carried in her heart: the weight of real combat, the knowledge that came from feeling an aircraft respond to your touch, from learning to trust your instincts when all the fancy electronics failed. "You know what your problem is, Mitchell," said as he passed by, adjusting his flight suit. "You're living in the past. This is modern warfare. We don't need cowboys anymore." Sarah climbed into her F-16's cockpit, running through her pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. The controls felt familiar under her hands, like greeting an old friend. Every switch, every gauge, every vibration of the engine told her a story. This aircraft had carried her through 3 tours of duty, through sandstorms over Iraq and mountain passes in Afghanistan. The other pilots saw an outdated machine. Sarah saw a warrior. As the squadron prepared for their training exercise, Sarah overheard Hayes talking to. "I give her 6 months before they ground her permanently. The Air Force is just being polite, letting her fade away gracefully." "6 months," laughed. "I say 3. Once the brass sees how outmatched she is, they'll pull her wings faster than you can say retirement home." Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but she channeled it into focus. She had faced skeptics before, instructors who said women didn't belong in fighters, commanders who questioned her judgment, enemies who underestimated her resolve. She had proven them all wrong, not with words but with results. The tower crackled through her headset. "Dragon Squadron, you are cleared for takeoff. Mitchell, you'll maintain position at the rear of the formation." "Roger that, Tower," Sarah replied, watching as the F-35s taxied ahead of her. Their engines whispered compared to the roar of her Fighting Falcon. Everything about them seemed designed to be invisible, untouchable. But Sarah knew something the young pilots had forgotten in their rush to embrace technology. Sometimes the old ways worked because they had been tested in the crucible of real combat. Sometimes experience mattered more than equipment. As her F-16 lifted off the runway, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had never faded in 20 years of flying. Below, the California desert stretched endlessly, but above, the sky was her domain. It had been her sanctuary when ground-bound officers questioned her abilities, her refuge when the weight of command grew too heavy. The formation flew north toward the training area, with Sarah trailing behind like an afterthought. In her headset, she could hear the casual chatter of the younger pilots, their confidence absolute. They spoke of engagement ranges and stealth signatures, of beyond visual range missiles and electronic countermeasures. Sarah listened and remembered her first combat mission, when half her squadron's electronics had failed due to enemy jamming. While the younger pilots had struggled to adapt, she had relied on her eyes, her instincts, and the honest feedback of her aircraft. She had brought her wingman home that day when his navigation system went dark. "Dragon lead to all aircraft," his voice cut through the chatter. "We'll be running simulated air-to-air combat today. The F-35s will practice coordinated attacks while Mitchell provides observation and backup." Backup. The word stung more than Sarah cared to admit. She had gone from squadron leader to backup in the span of 5 years, watching as younger pilots over her based on the capabilities of their aircraft rather than their skills. As they approached the training area, Sarah caught sight of something on her radar that made her frown. Multiple contacts, moving fast and low. She switched to a different frequency, trying to get a clearer reading. "Dragon lead, this is Dragon 6, she called, using her call sign. "I'm picking up unidentified aircraft bearing 270, approximately 50 miles out." "Negative, Dragon 6, replied. "Training area is clear, probably just atmospheric interference. Your older radar system isn't as reliable as ours." Sarah stared at her scope. The contacts were still there, moving in a coordinated pattern that looked anything but random. She had seen enough real threats to know the difference between interference and enemy aircraft. But who was she to argue? Just an old pilot in an outdated fighter, apparently seeing ghosts where none existed. The exercise began, with the F-35s demonstrating their superior technology. They could engage targets at ranges Sarah's F-16 couldn't even detect, their stealth capabilities making them nearly invisible to conventional radar. Sarah watched from her position at the rear, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. This was her new reality, relegated to the sidelines while newer technology took center stage. But those contacts on her radar hadn't disappeared. If anything, they were getting closer. The training exercise continued with military precision. Sarah maintained her position at the back of the formation, watching as the F-35 pilots demonstrated their advanced capabilities. Their aircraft moved like ghosts across the desert sky, appearing and disappearing from radar screens with the flip of a switch. "Dragon 2 to Dragon lead," Hayes reported, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Target acquired at 40 miles. Missile lock confirmed." "Beautiful work," Hayes responded. "Dragon 3, your turn." F-35 banked sharply, its stealth profile making it nearly invisible even to Sarah's trained eye. "Fox 2, he called out, simulating a missile launch. "Target destroyed." The younger pilots were impressive, Sarah had to admit. Their technology gave them capabilities she could only dream of. But as she monitored her instruments, those mysterious contacts continued to appear on her screen. They were closer now, perhaps 30 miles out and moving with purpose. "Dragon lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah called again. "I'm still tracking multiple bogies. They're maintaining radio silence and flying in attack formation." "Mitchell, knock it off," his voice carried an edge of irritation. "We've been over this. There are no unidentified aircraft in this area. Focus on the exercise." Sarah bit back her response. She had been tracking aircraft by radar for 2 decades, through every kind of weather and electronic interference imaginable. She knew the difference between a malfunction and real contacts. Maybe her radar needs calibration. His voice crackled through the comm, loud enough for everyone to hear. These old birds develop glitches. Or maybe the pilot needs calibration, Hayes added, drawing laughter from the other F-35 pilots. Sarah's grip tightened on her controls. She had faced enemy fire over 3 different countries, had saved the lives of downed pilots, had earned more commendations than most of these kids would see in their entire careers. But none of that mattered when your aircraft was considered obsolete. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes. The F-35s performed flawlessly, their pilots growing more confident with each simulated engagement. Sarah remained in her support role, documenting their performance and providing backup communications. But the contacts on her radar were now less than 20 miles away. Dragon Squadron, this is Control, the voice from Edwards Air Force Base cut through the exercise chatter. We're showing unknown aircraft entering your training area. Can you confirm? His voice was sharp with surprise. Control, this is Dragon Lead. We show no contacts on our scopes. Sarah's heart raced. Finally, confirmation from the ground. Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 6. I've been tracking these contacts for the past 30 minutes. 6 aircraft flying in 2-ship formations approaching from the west. There was a moment of silence before responded. Dragon 6, why didn't your contacts show up on our radar? Because they're flying low, sir. Below the radar horizon for your higher altitude. My position at the rear of the formation gives me a different angle. Suddenly, his voice cut through the comm with urgency. Visual contact. 6 F-22 Raptors bearing 280. They're not broadcasting IFF signals. The F-22 Raptor was the Air Force's most advanced air superiority fighter, even more sophisticated than the F-35s. If these aircraft weren't identifying themselves, it meant they were either malfunctioning or operating under strict radio silence. This is Dragon Lead to unknown aircraft, transmitted on the emergency frequency. Identify yourselves immediately. No response. Control, this is Dragon Lead. We need immediate clarification on these F-22s. Are they part of an unannounced exercise? Negative, Dragon Lead. We show no scheduled F-22 operations in your area. Sarah's combat instincts kicked in. She had seen this scenario before: aircraft operating without identification, maintaining radio silence, approaching a training formation. It was either a very realistic surprise exercise or something much more serious. Dragon Squadron, this is Control. Those aircraft are not ours. Repeat, not ours. We're tracking 6 stolen F-22 Raptors that went missing from Langley Air Force Base 3 hours ago. Suspect inside job. Pilots believed to be hostile. The words hit the formation like a thunderbolt. Stolen F-22s meant someone with inside knowledge had taken the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal. The implications were terrifying. Dragon Squadron, you are ordered to intercept and force down the hostile aircraft. Control continued. Rules of engagement are weapons tight until further notice. His voice was tight with tension. Roger, Control. Dragon Squadron, form up for intercept. The F-35s banked toward the approaching F-22s, their pilots' earlier confidence replaced by grim determination. But as they closed the distance, a harsh reality became apparent. Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 2, Hayes reported. They're jamming our targeting systems. I can't get a lock. Same here, added. Electronic countermeasures are blocking everything. Sarah watched from her trailing position as the most advanced fighters in the Air Force struggled against even more advanced opponents. The stolen F-22s had every technological advantage, plus the element of surprise and apparent inside knowledge of American systems. Dragon Squadron, this is Control. Air National Guard F-16s are scrambling from March Air Reserve Base, but they're 20 minutes out. You're on your own until reinforcements arrive. 20 minutes. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. 6 F-22s against 5 F-35s and 1 F-16, with the enemy holding every technological advantage. The math was brutal. Dragon 3 is spiked. His voice crackled with alarm. I'm being painted by targeting radar. Break left, ordered. All aircraft evasive maneuvers. The F-35 scattered, their pilots using every trick they knew to break the targeting locks. But the F-22s pressed their attack, their superior speed and agility allowing them to maintain pursuit. Sarah found herself in a unique position. While the F-35s were being hunted by aircraft specifically designed to counter their technology, her older F-16 was being largely ignored. To the F-22 pilots, she was probably just a training aircraft, not worth their immediate attention. That mistake would cost them. Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah transmitted. I'm moving to support Dragon 3. Negative, Dragon 6 replied. You don't have the capabilities to engage F-22s. Stay clear. But Sarah was already turning towards position. Her F-16 might be older, but it was also more predictable to fly, more responsive to pilot input. In a turning fight, experience could overcome technology. Dragon 3, this is Dragon 6. I'm on your 6. Break right on my mark. Are you crazy, Mitchell? The voice was strained with G-forces. This thing will eat you alive. Sarah ignored him, focusing on the F-22 pursuing F-35. The enemy pilot was so focused on his prey that he hadn't noticed Sarah's approach. Sometimes the hunter became the hunted. Dragon 3, break right, now. F-35 snapped into a hard right turn, and Sarah saw her opportunity. The F-22, committed to its intercept course, passed directly through her targeting zone. For a moment, Sarah had a clear shot at the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger as the F-22 Raptor filled her targeting display. The enemy pilot, focused entirely on fleeing F-35, had made the fatal mistake of ignoring what he perceived as an obsolete threat. Fox 2, Sarah called out, simulating a missile launch. In real combat, the F-22 would have been destroyed. But this was no ordinary engagement, and the rules were about to change dramatically. The F-22 pilot suddenly realized his error, braking hard left and climbing rapidly. But Sarah's maneuver had achieved its purpose, was free and clear, his F-35 disappearing into the desert haze with its superior stealth capabilities. Nice work, Dragon 6, his voice came through the comm, and for the first time there was respect instead of mockery in his tone. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. The F-22 she had just threatened was now focused entirely on her, and she was flying an aircraft that was outmatched in every measurable category. Dragon 6, you've got a Raptor on your tail, Hayes warned. He's locked on. Sarah threw her F-16 into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, pulling G-forces that pushed the aging aircraft to its limits. The F-22 followed effortlessly, its pilot clearly skilled and now very angry at being embarrassed by an older fighter. Dragon Lead to all aircraft, his voice cut through the chaos. The hostiles are using our own countermeasures against us. They know every weakness in our systems. That confirmed Sarah's worst fears. These weren't just stolen aircraft. They were being flown by pilots with intimate knowledge of American tactics and technology, traitors or foreign agents who had studied their enemy well. Dragon 6, get out of there, ordered. You can't win a dogfight against a Raptor. But Sarah had no choice. The F-22 was closing fast, and her only hope was to do something unpredictable, something that wouldn't be in any manual or training scenario. She pulled her F-16 into a climb so steep it seemed to defy physics, the older fighter's powerful engine screaming as it clawed for altitude. The F-22 followed easily, but Sarah wasn't trying to outclimb her pursuer. At the peak of her climb, just as her airspeed bled off to nearly nothing, Sarah executed a maneuver that had been banned from training exercises for being too dangerous. She flipped her fighter into a controlled flat spin, essentially falling out of the sky while maintaining just enough control to recover. The F-22 pilot, expecting conventional tactics, overshot spectacularly. Suddenly, Sarah was behind him instead of in front. "What the hell was that?" His voice carried amazement and alarm. "Something they don't teach in flight school," Sarah replied grimly, fighting to bring her F-16 out of its spin before she lost too much altitude. The maneuver had worked, but it had also revealed her position to the other F-22s. Now she was being hunted by multiple aircraft, each one vastly superior to her own. "Dragon Squadron, this is Control," the voice from Edwards crackled through the static. "We're tracking a massive cyber attack on our air defense networks. The hostiles aren't just stealing aircraft, they're trying to blind our entire air defense system." The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind. This wasn't just theft, it was the opening move in a much larger attack. The stolen F-22s were creating chaos while hackers worked to penetrate America's air defenses. "All aircraft, this is Dragon Lead." His voice was tight with urgency. "New priority. We need to prevent these F-22s from reaching populated areas. They could be carrying payloads." Sarah's blood ran cold. F-22s modified to carry bombs instead of air-to-air missiles could devastate civilian targets. Los Angeles was less than 200 miles south, with millions of innocent people. "Dragon 6 to Dragon Lead," Sarah transmitted. "I can see external modifications on the nearest F-22, looks like for external ordnance." "Confirmed," Hayes added. "Same here, these birds are loaded for ground attack." The situation had just become exponentially worse. Not only were they facing superior aircraft, but those aircraft were apparently carrying weapons designed to kill civilians. "Control, this is Dragon Lead. How long until reinforcements arrive?" "Dragon Lead, March Air Reserve F-16s are still 15 minutes out. Is scrambling additional aircraft, but they're 40 minutes away." 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. At the speed the F-22s were traveling, they could reach major population centers long before help arrived. Sarah watched her radar screen as the hostile aircraft began to split up. 3 were engaging the F-35s, while the other 3 were heading southeast, directly toward Los Angeles. "Dragon Lead, 3 bandits are breaking off," Sarah reported. "Bearing 140 heading for the coast." "I see them," replied. "Dragon 4 and 5 intercept those aircraft. Do not let them reach civilian areas." 2 of the F-35s peeled off in pursuit, but Sarah could see the tactical problem immediately. The F-22s had a significant head start and superior speed. Even with their stealth capabilities, the F-35s might not catch them in time. Unless someone slowed the F-22s down. "Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "I'm closest to the breakaway group. I can intercept." "Negative, Dragon 6. You're no match for 3 F-22s. Sarah was already turning toward the fleeing aircraft. "Maybe not, sir, but I can slow them down long enough for Dragons 4 and 5 to catch up." "Mitchell, that's suicide." Perhaps it was. Sarah's F-16 against 3 F-22 Raptors was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, but sometimes the mission was more important than the pilot. She thought of her daughter Jenny, studying engineering at Caltech, of her elderly parents in Phoenix, of the millions of people who would die if those F-22s reached their targets. "Dragon 6, return to formation immediately," ordered. But Sarah was already pushing her throttle to maximum, her F-16 screaming across the desert sky toward an intercept course with the 3 fleeing F-22s. Her aircraft might be older, but it still carried missiles and guns. She might not survive the encounter, but she could make the enemy pay a price. "Sarah, don't do this." His voice came through the comm, and she was surprised to hear genuine concern instead of his usual arrogance. "Take care of the others," Sarah replied, "and tell my daughter I love her." She switched off her radio and focused entirely on the intercept. 3 F-22s, flying in loose formation, loaded with weapons and heading for innocent civilians. Sarah had trained her entire career for moments like this, though she had never imagined it would come against American aircraft flown by traitors. The desert landscape blurred beneath her as she pushed her F-16 to its absolute limits. The engine temperature was climbing into the red zone, but she didn't dare reduce power. Every second counted. Ahead, the 3 F-22s appeared as dots on the horizon, growing larger as she closed the distance. They had detected her approach and were beginning evasive maneuvers, but they were also trying to maintain their course toward Los Angeles. That conflict would give Sarah the opening she needed. As she approached missile range, Sarah realized that this might be her last flight, but if it was, she would make it count. Sarah's F-16 screamed across the Mojave Desert at maximum speed, her engine temperature gauges buried in the red zone. The 3 F-22 Raptors ahead had detected her approach and were beginning to react, but they were caught between two conflicting priorities: deal with her threat or continue toward their target. That hesitation would be their downfall. "Unknown F-16, you are ordered to break off immediately," came a transmission on the emergency frequency. The voice was American but cold and professional. "This is your only warning." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she armed her missiles and selected the lead F-22 as her target. The range was still too great for a guaranteed hit, but she was closing fast. The lead F-22 suddenly broke hard right, abandoning the formation to engage her directly. That left two aircraft continuing toward Los Angeles, but Sarah had forced them to split their forces. "Fox 3, Sarah called out, launching her first missile at maximum range. The AIM-120 AMRAAM streaked across the sky, its radar seeker locked onto the approaching F-22. The enemy pilot immediately began defensive maneuvers, dispensing chaff and flares while turning to defeat the missile's approach angle. The missile missed, exploding harmlessly in the desert air, but it had served its purpose. The F-22 was now fully committed to engaging Sarah instead of proceeding to its target. Behind her, Sarah could hear radio chatter as the rest of Dragon's squadron continued their battle with the remaining F-22s. Was coordinating the defense while Hayes tried to intercept the other two aircraft heading for the coast. But Sarah's world had narrowed to just her, and the F-22 now bearing down on her position. The enemy pilot was skilled, probably a former American aviator who had turned traitor. He flew with the precision and aggression of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Fox 2, the enemy pilot transmitted, and Sarah's threat warning system screamed as an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile launched from the F-22. Sarah threw her F-16 into a diving spiral, pulling G-forces that made her vision gray at the edges. The Sidewinder followed, its infrared seeker locked onto her engine exhaust. At the last second, Sarah pulled up sharply and deployed flares, the sudden change in direction, and the heat sources confusing the missile's guidance system. The Sidewinder detonated 50 feet behind her aircraft, close enough to shower her F-16 with shrapnel but not close enough to bring her down. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel, and she could feel her aircraft's handling becoming sluggish. But she was still flying, and that was more than the enemy pilot had expected. "Dragon 4 to Dragon 6, Hayes' voice crackled through the comm. "We're 5 minutes behind the other two F-22s. Can you hold your position?" Sarah looked at her damaged aircraft's status. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, her radar was intermittent, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit, but her weapon systems were still functional. "Roger, Dragon 4, I'll keep this one busy." The F-22 was coming around again, setting up for another attack run. This time, Sarah didn't wait for him to shoot first. She pulled her F-16 into a head-on approach, a game of chicken that would test both pilots' nerves. "Fox 2, she called, launching her second missile directly into the F-22's path. The enemy pilot was forced to break off his attack to avoid the missile, giving Sarah the opening she needed. She rolled inverted and pulled hard, bringing her aircraft around in a tight circle that her older F-16 could handle better than the more sophisticated F-22. For a moment, she was on the F-22's tail, her targeting system achieving a brief lock. But before she could fire, the enemy pilot pulled a maneuver that Sarah had never seen before, a vertical climb followed by a backward loop that brought him around behind her in seconds. "Impossible," Sarah muttered. "No aircraft should be able to perform that maneuver without stalling." But then she realized what she was facing. The F-22 had been modified, probably with thrust vectoring enhancements that gave it capabilities beyond the standard aircraft. These weren't just stolen fighters, they were prototypes or experimental variants. The enemy pilot now had Sarah in his sights, and her damaged F-16 couldn't match the modified F-22's maneuverability. But Sarah had one advantage that no amount of technology could replicate: 20 years of combat experience, and the knowledge that sometimes survival meant doing the unexpected. She cut her engine. The sudden loss of power caused her F-16 to drop like a stone, falling away from the F-22's targeting solution. The enemy pilot, expecting her to try to outmaneuver him, overshot completely. Sarah restarted her engine at the bottom of her dive, pulling up just a few hundred feet above the desert floor. The F-22 was now above her, trying to regain the advantage, but Sarah was already climbing back toward him. "Dragon lead to Dragon 6's voice cut through the static. "Dragon 4 and 5 have engaged the other F-22s. One bandit is down, but they need backup." Sarah gritted her teeth. She needed to end this fight and help her squadron mates, but the F-22 pilot wasn't making it easy. The two aircraft met head-on again, both pilots firing simultaneously. Sarah's cannon round sparked off the F-22's armor while an enemy missile streaked past her canopy, missing by inches. But in that exchange, Sarah noticed something crucial. The F-22's external modifications made it less stealthy and more vulnerable to conventional weapons. The stolen aircraft might have superior performance, but they had sacrificed some of their defensive capabilities. "Dragon 6 to Dragon lead," Sarah transmitted. "The modified F-22s have exposed systems. Target the external, they're vulnerable." "Roger, Dragon 6, good intel." Sarah's own fight was reaching a critical point. Her fuel was running low, her aircraft was damaged, and the F-22 pilot was pressing his attack with renewed aggression. But she had bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. In the distance, she could see contrails approaching from the east, the Air National Guard F-16s from March Air Reserve Base. Help was finally on the way. The F-22 pilot must have seen them too, because his tactics suddenly became more desperate. Instead of the calculated precision from before, he began taking risks, trying to finish Sarah quickly so he could escape or rejoin his companions. That desperation would be his undoing. Sarah waited for the perfect moment, then pulled her most dangerous maneuver yet. She flew directly at the desert floor in a near-vertical dive, forcing the F-22 to follow. At the last possible second, she pulled up hard, her F-16's wingtips nearly touching the sand. The F-22 pilot, caught off guard by her reckless maneuver, pulled up a fraction of a second too late. His modified fighter struck the desert floor at over 400 miles per hour, creating a fireball that lit up the afternoon sky. Sarah climbed away from the explosion, her hands shaking on the controls. She had just destroyed the most advanced fighter aircraft in American inventory, flown by a traitor who had underestimated both her skill and her determination. Dragon 6, this is Dragon Lead. Voice carried a note of amazement. Confirm your status. Dragon 6 is operational, Sarah replied, though her aircraft was held together more by willpower than structural integrity. One bandit down, moving to support Dragons 4 and 5. As she turned toward the remaining battle, Sarah realized that everything had changed. The young pilots who had mocked her outdated fighter now understood that experience and determination could overcome any technological advantage. But the fight wasn't over yet. Sarah's battered F-16 limped through the sky toward the sounds of combat echoing over the radio. Her instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights, and she could feel her aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control. But the adrenaline of victory over the F-22 kept her focused on the mission. Dragon 4 to all aircraft, Hayes' voice crackled through the static, strained with G-forces. We're engaged with 2 F-22s over the Antelope Valley. Dragon 5 is hit and RTB. Was returning to base, damaged but alive. That left Hayes alone against 2 of the most advanced fighters in the world, while Sarah struggled to reach his position in her crippled aircraft. Dragon 6 is inbound, Sarah transmitted, 2 minutes out. Negative, Dragon 6's voice cut in. Your aircraft is too damaged, RTB immediately. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and hydraulic pressure readings. Was right, she should return to base. Any reasonable pilot would land immediately and count themselves lucky to be alive. But Sarah could hear the desperation in Hayes' voice as he fought for his life against impossible odds. The same young pilot who had mocked her outdated fighter was now facing the reality of aerial combat, where technology meant nothing if you were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah said firmly. I still have weapons and I'm still flying. Dragon 4 needs support. She pushed her throttle forward, coaxing every ounce of power from her damaged engine. Black smoke streamed from her exhaust, and her aircraft shuddered with each control input, but she was still airworthy. Ahead, she could see the contrails of the dogfight. Hayes' F-35 was turning desperately, while 2 F-22s closed in from different angles. Even with his advanced stealth capabilities, he was being hunted by aircraft specifically designed to counter his advantages. Dragon 4, this is Dragon 6, Sarah called. I'm coming in from your 7 o'clock. On my mark, brake hard left. Sarah, get out of here, Hayes replied. These things will tear you apart. Maybe, Sarah admitted, but they'll have to catch me first. She dove toward the nearest F-22, her damaged F-16 screaming through the air at maximum speed. The enemy pilot, focused on Hayes, didn't notice her approach until her targeting radar painted his aircraft. Fox 2, Sarah called, launching her last missile. The F-22 broke off his attack on Hayes to deal with the incoming threat, but Sarah's missile found its mark. The AMRAAM exploded against the enemy fighter's port wing, sending the advanced aircraft tumbling toward the desert in a ball of flame. Splash 1, Hayes called out, amazement clear in his voice. Nice shot, Sarah. But Sarah's victory was short-lived. The remaining F-22 pilot, now outnumbered 2-1, made a tactical decision that caught both American pilots off guard. Instead of engaging them, he turned southeast and accelerated to maximum speed. He's running, Hayes exclaimed. No, Sarah realized with growing horror. He's heading for Los Angeles. The mission was always the target, not the dogfight. The lone F-22 was now racing toward the coast, carrying unknown ordnance and flying the most advanced interceptor in the American arsenal. Even with his head start, Hayes' F-35 might be able to catch him, but Sarah's damaged F-16 had no chance. Dragon 4, pursue that aircraft, Sarah ordered. Don't let him reach civilian areas." "What about you?" Hayes asked. Sarah looked at her instruments. Fuel was critically low, hydraulic pressure was nearly zero, and her engine temperature was climbing toward catastrophic failure. She might make it back to Edwards, but it would be close. "I'll make it," she lied. "Go." Hayes' F-35 streaked after the fleeing F-22, leaving Sarah alone in the sky with a dying aircraft. But as she turned toward home, her radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. "All aircraft, this is Thunderbolt Lead," came a new voice. "6 F-16s from March Air Reserve Base, inbound to your position." Sarah looked east and saw them, 6 Fighting Falcons in perfect formation, their pilots ready for combat. The cavalry had finally arrived. "Thunderbolt Lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah transmitted. "Single F-22 proceeding southeast toward Los Angeles, carrying unknown ordnance. Dragon 4 is in pursuit but may need assistance." "Roger, Dragon 6, we have him on radar. Thunderbolt Squadron is moving to intercept." Sarah watched as the 6 F-16s streaked past her position, their pilots flying the same type of aircraft she had just used to defeat 2 F-22 Raptors. For a moment, she felt a surge of pride. Her outdated fighter might not have the latest technology, but in the right hands, it was still a formidable weapon. "Dragon 6, this is Control," the voice from Edwards cut through her thoughts. "We're tracking massive explosions at March Air Reserve Base. The cyber attack was a diversion. Enemy ground forces have struck multiple installations." Sarah's blood ran cold. While they had been fighting the stolen F-22s in the air, other enemies had been attacking air bases on the ground. This wasn't just theft, it was a coordinated assault on American air power. "All aircraft, this is Dragon Lead," his voice carried new urgency. "We're ordered to return to Edwards immediately. Base is under attack." Sarah's mind raced. Her home base under attack, her squadron scattered, and her aircraft barely flyable. But as she turned toward Edwards, she noticed something on her damaged radar screen that made her heart skip a beat. More contacts were approaching from the south, helicopters flying low and fast toward Edwards Air Force Base. The air attack had been just the beginning. "Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 6, Sarah transmitted. "Multiple rotary wing aircraft approaching Edwards from the south. Looks like an assault force." "Confirmed," replied grimly. "Ground radar shows 6 helicopters, probably carrying troops. They're trying to capture the base while our fighters are scattered." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge. She had perhaps 10 minutes of flying time left, and her aircraft was falling apart around her. But Edwards was her home, and her fellow were on the ground facing an enemy assault. "Dragon Lead, I can intercept the helicopters," Sarah said. "Negative, Dragon 6. Your aircraft won't survive another engagement." Sarah was already turning toward the approaching helicopters. Her F-16 might be dying, but it still carried cannon rounds. Helicopters, no matter how heavily armed, were vulnerable to fighter aircraft. "Dragon Squadron, this is Dragon 6, she transmitted on the general frequency. "I'm engaging the helicopter assault force. If I don't make it back, tell my daughter that her mother died protecting the freedom she believes in." Sarah dove toward the desert floor, using the terrain to mask her approach. The helicopters were flying in formation, confident that American air defenses had been neutralized. They were about to learn otherwise. Her cannon had perhaps 3 seconds of ammunition left, but against helicopters, that might be enough. Sarah lined up her attack run, ignoring the warning lights and alarms that filled her cockpit. "This is for everyone who said I was too old," she whispered and opened fire. Her cannon rounds tore through the lead helicopter, sending it spinning toward the ground in flames. The other aircraft scattered, but Sarah was already turning toward the second target. Her engine finally gave up, coughing once before falling silent, but she still had forward momentum and one more target in range. Sarah's F-16 glided silently toward the second helicopter, her cannons firing until they ran dry. The enemy aircraft exploded in a fireball that lit up the desert sky. With no power and no altitude, Sarah had seconds to find a place to crash land. She spotted a flat section of desert and aimed for it, her aircraft hitting the sand at over 200 miles per hour. The world went dark. Sarah woke up in the Edwards Air Force Base medical facility 3 days later, her head wrapped in bandages and her body aching from the crash. The first face she saw was her daughter Jenny's, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom," Jenny whispered, taking her hand, "they said you might not wake up." "Takes more than a little crash to keep me down," Sarah managed, her voice hoarse. "How long was I out?" 3 days. You've been unconscious since they pulled you from the wreckage." Through the window, Sarah could see F-16s and F-35s on the flight line, their crews preparing for missions. The base was still operational, which meant the attack had been repelled. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "The helicopters, the base." Colonel appeared in the doorway, his usually stern expression replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. "You happened, Mitchell. Your attack on those helicopters broke up their assault formation. Ground forces were able to repel the remaining attackers." "The F-22s?" "All 6 accounted for. Hayes and the March Air Reserve F-16s got the last one before it reached populated areas. Turns out they were carrying stolen nuclear material, probably intended for a dirty bomb attack on Lowe's Angels." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what they had prevented. Millions of lives saved because an outdated fighter and an aging pilot had refused to give up. "There's more," continued. "The investigation revealed that this was a coordinated attack by a terrorist cell with inside help, former American pilots who had been recruited by foreign agents. They specifically chose to strike when they thought our most experienced pilots would be grounded or retired." "They underestimated us," Sarah said simply. "No," replied, "they underestimated you." Over the following days, as Sarah recovered, the full story emerged. The cyber attack, the stolen F-22s, and the ground assault had all been part of a larger plan to cripple American air defenses. The terrorists had counted on newer technology and younger pilots being unable to adapt when their systems were compromised. They hadn't counted on a 42-year-old pilot in a 20-year-old fighter who remembered how to fight without computers. "You know what's funny?" said during one of his visits to her hospital bed. "We all thought you were the weak link in the squadron. Turns out you were the strongest." "Experience isn't weakness," Sarah replied. "It's just unfashionable." Hayes nodded from across the room. "Command is recommending you for the Medal of Honor, single-handedly engaging 6 F-22s and preventing a terrorist attack on civilian targets." Sarah shook her head. "I had help. The whole squadron fought those aircraft." "But you fought them alone," said quietly. "When everyone else said it was impossible, you proved them wrong." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon as the Secretary of Defense pinned the Medal of Honor to her uniform. Her F-16, recovered from the desert crash site, was being restored for display at the Air and Space Museum. But more importantly, the Air Force had announced changes to its pilot training program. Experience would now be valued alongside technology, and older aircraft would remain in service as training platforms. The lesson of Sarah Mitchell's victory was being integrated into military doctrine. "What's next for you, Captain?" a reporter asked during the ceremony. Sarah looked out at the audience, filled with young pilots who now understood that courage and skill mattered more than the age of your aircraft or the gray in your hair. "I'm going back to flying," she said simply. "They've offered me command of the new experienced pilot training squadron. We're going to teach the next generation that sometimes the old ways work because they've been tested in real combat." Now one of her strongest supporters raised his hand. Will you still be flying the F-16? Sarah smiled. Every chance I get. That outdated fighter saved a lot of lives. It deserves respect. Later, as she walked across the tarmac at Edwards, Sarah paused beside a gleaming new F-35. Its pilot, a young lieutenant fresh from training, saluted respectfully. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," the young woman said. "You've shown us that it's not about the aircraft, it's about the pilot." Sarah returned the salute. "Remember that, Lieutenant. Technology changes, but courage never goes out of style." As she climbed into the cockpit of her new F-16, not quite as old as her previous fighter, but still bearing the honest lines of a proven design, Sarah felt the familiar surge of belonging. The younger pilots no longer laughed at her outdated fighter. They understood now that in the right hands, any aircraft could change the course of history. The engine started with a reassuring roar, and Sarah taxied toward the runway. Above the desert sky beckoned, vast and eternal, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had proven that experience could overcome technology, that courage could defeat superior numbers, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by those others had written off as obsolete. As her F-16 lifted off the runway, Sarah Mitchell smiled. Let them build newer, faster, more sophisticated fighters. She would be ready to show their pilots that in aerial combat, the warrior mattered more than the weapon. The sky was still her domain, and she intended to keep it that way.